In this lesson, we're going to create a kicker assembly for our robot by using various mates and tools available in SOLIDWORKS. To begin, open up a new assembly project and import the bearing and two bearing housings from our given parts. Place them on our workplace as shown. Now let's bring the two housings together by first placing a concentric mate between the inner circles of the housing, then use a coincident mate on the back side of the housing. Lastly, place a parallel mate to align the housings correctly. Now let's mate the bearing into the housing by placing a coincident mate between the back face of the bearing and the extruded face of the housing. To complete our bearing assembly, place a concentric mate between the inner circle of the bearing and the inner circle of the housing. Our next step is to add the bearing mount, which we'll use to attach the kicker to the main assembly. Import the bearing mount into our assembly. Then we'll place a concentric mate between the bottom of the groove and the inside circular surface of the bearing. Then place a coincident mate between the back face of the bearing and the mount. Finish up by placing a parallel mate between the outer edge of the mount and the inner edge of the bearing housing. Let's save our assembly and name it Bearings Assembly. The reason we're saving it is because we'll need to import another set of identical bearings later on in this lesson. We're now going to build the kicking mechanism of our kicker assembly. Let's get started by inserting the main shaft part into our assembly. Place a concentric mate between the shaft and the inner surface of the bearing. Then, let's place a mate between the outer face of the main shaft and the outer face of the bearing mount to align them. Next, let's insert two kicking shafts and two shaft brackets into our assembly. We'll need to place two concentric mates for each shaft. The mates will be from the kicking shaft to the hole on each shaft bracket. Repeat the process for the other kicking shaft and our kicking mechanism will be complete. Now let's add four mates between the outer circular face of the kicking shafts and the outer face of the shaft bracket. Now let's place a concentric mate between the main shaft and the hole in the shaft bracket. Place another mate between the outer face of the shaft bracket and the extruded face of the bearing to bring our kicker together. We're now ready to add the gear assembly into our kicker. Import the gear bracket and the gear into our assembly project. place a concentric mate between the inner surface of the bracket and the main shaft. Then, use a coincident mate between the outer faces of the gear bracket and the shaft bracket. Similarly, place a concentric mate between the gear and the main shaft. Then place a coincident mate between the surface of the gear to the inside face of the gear bracket. Lastly, let's place a lock mate between any top edge of the gear and the top edge of the shaft bracket so that they move synchronously. All we're missing now is the other set of bearings. We can use the Insert Components tool to insert the bearings assembly we created earlier in this lesson. Then, use the various mates we have already used to complete our kicker assembly. Always remember that in designing robots, a good modeling technique would be to make primary use of the concentric mates. It's because concentric mates will identify and align the holes, shafts, bearings, and other parts that we're mating. In this lesson, we created the kicker assembly by using the skills taught in previous lessons and various mates such as concentric, distance, and coincidence to effectively assemble our kicker.